list, it might take a half minute or a minute for all attendees to finish joining.
Okay, great. We are live on YouTube. Okay, wonderful. So then we are live on YouTube. Chandra, remember to post on Facebook also the link to the live YouTube stream. Now we start. Good evening. My name is PJ Di Pietro. Gender pronouns they, them, their. I have an announcement first about accessibility. The event is supported by American Sign Language interpreters and the captioning service. In order to access closed captions, look for the captions button or icon at the bottom of your screen, or you can find more detailed instructions under the link that we are dropping in the chat right now. Let me now introduce myself. My name, as I said, is PJ, and I am a member of the Democratizing Knowledge Collective at Syracuse University, where I also work in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you on behalf of DK, the Democratizing Knowledge Collective, to the webinar Centering Native American and Indigenous Communities, Decolonizing Pandemic Politics. We would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The first portion of the land acknowledgement is the College of Arts and Sciences at Syracuse University's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. Now, we also enhance and add, we want to enhance and add the university's acknowledgement. And we want to add, because without actions to accompany the words of the statement, they can become empty of the responsibilities we have to the Onondaga people as guests on their unceded territories. According to the Nez Waterman from the Turtle Clan, Haudenosaunee is an ancient name which means people of the Lone House. That is, a group of people, the philosophy, a way of life, and the customs that stretch over hundreds and hundreds of miles. Our webinar tonight is part of the Democratizing Knowledge Collective webinar series, Communities of Color, Injustice, and Multiple Pandemics. This series brings together artists, community activists, scientists, and scholars to address the multiple pandemics facing communities of color today. I am sorry. I believe someone is asking in the chat whether there are captions. Jackie or Himika, if someone could answer to that, that would be helpful. Thank you. Again, this series brings together artists, community activists, scientists, and scholars to address the multiple pandemics facing communities of color today, from police violence to COVID-19, from environmental racism to economic injustice, to incarceration and detention. With this series, we mean to foreground the Black, Brown, Asian, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native American, and First Peoples communities of North America. Our first webinar, Resisting the Racism of COVID-19, took place on December 8th, 2020. The webinar's collective reflection seeks to build on the statement, "We can't breathe," that DK authored last summer and that you can find on our website, Democratizing Knowledge, if you are interested in reading the statement. DK is a collective that seeks to revitalize and transform the reach of all knowledges to address difference, identity, equality, justice, citizenship, and democracy, and making these knowledges more visible, more sustainable, and more institutionally public on the campus and beyond. The members of the collective present today are Dr. Himika Bhattacharya, Dr. Linda Carty, Dr. Paula Johnson, Dr. Chandra Tatpari Mohanty, and Dr. Jackie Orr. Our colleague Delarice Caulfield Martinez couldn't join us today. You can find more information about our membership in the link that we are adding to the chat now. Now, we'd also like to thank all of the comrades, friends, and units on campus that have supported this event. They are African American Studies, the Cold Case Justice Initiative, Cultural Foundations of Education, Department of Biology, Latino and Latin American Studies Program, the Lender Center for Social Justice, Lightwork, Native American and Indigenous Studies Program, the Sociology Department, Syracuse University Humanities Center, the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, and Women in Science and Engineering, otherwise known as WISE. Special thanks to Tom Fazio at the Maxwell School IT team and Suzanne DeMocker-Shed, the administrative specialist at the Women's and Gender Studies Department. Finally, Kate and Daniel are with us this evening as ASL interpreters, and Jessica is responsible for the closed captioning. Thank you all. Our second webinar this evening, centering Native American and Indigenous communities, decolonizing pandemic politics, examines the crisis of COVID-19 within a broader history of structural violence and its impact on land, language, environment, and personal and communal well-being. The conversation this evening will reflect on the realities of various nations, including the local Onondaga Nation. When we began discussing the need to foreground the realities of Native American and First Peoples in the analysis of COVID-19 and its connection to multiple pandemics, we reflected on the ethical and political aspects of this collaboration. We were hesitant to reach out to the guest panelists in the name of allyship. For us, the practice of allyship seems to assume that there is a distance between the location of allies and the location of their political commitments. Instead, as activist scholars implicated by settler subjectivities, we seek to enact a decolonizing ethics of care. To this aim, we engaged in a process of collaboration with our comrade and colleague, Dr. Danica Medak-Saltzman, who very generously accepted our invitation to serve as co-facilitator. This collaboration also included reaching out to Philip Arnold, chair of the religion department at SU, and to Sandy Bigtree Mohawk. They are co-founders of the Indigenous Values Initiative and provided critical insight on the composition of our panel this evening. Through conversations with Danica and the panelists, we shaped the framing and formatting of this event. The panelists have chosen to introduce themselves. As a political statement, they would like to avoid lengthy bios and introductions. Dr. Medak Saltzman, Turtle Mountain, Chippewa, is an assistant professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies and an affiliate of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Syracuse University. Let me now turn the mic over to her.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, PJ. Welcome everyone this evening. This is a very exciting opportunity, and I want to say that I am honored and humbled to be here with this fabulous lineup and at a generous invitation of DK. And in our vision of this event, we wanted it to be conversational. We wanted to make sure that we were all participating in this in a way that allowed for the multiplicity of voices to represent the multiplicities of experience across Indian country. And so we decided to separate kind of the conversation into two parts. The first part will be kind of led by one question that I will pose to the speakers in a moment. And the second section will be, then there will be time for questions. And then after that, there will be another question posed to the panelists, and then another period of questions and answers. So please do feel free to make note of any questions you might have as you move forward. And without further ado, I'd like to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe we should start with Jessica. You're at the top of my screen.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much, Danica, and thank you to the whole DK team for inviting me to chat with you today. My name is Dr. Jessica Kolopenik. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, which is located in Amiskwaci, Waskahikan, or otherwise known as Edmonton, Alberta, which sits amongst Treaty 6 and Métis territory. I'm Cree from Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. My mom is she's from Peguis, and my dad is what the Cree call Munyao, or a white guy. And I am so thrilled to be here. My research, I'm not sure exactly what I can tell you or what I should be telling you during the intro here, but just to give you a sense of my research. I try to understand how science and technology is shaped and in turn shapes this big thing we call colonialism, this big concept. And in particular, I investigate the ways that genome sciences in various fields, such as bioanthropology, forensic science policy, biomedical knowledge and research in particular, and bioethics, how they're reshaping definitions of indigeneity in ways that are often still quite colonial and impact Indigenous peoples without ever involving Indigenous peoples in that process. So that's, I'm sure we'll get more into that. One last note is just that I co-lead the Indigenous Science, Technology, and Society research and training program at the University of Alberta. It's quite a mouthful, with my colleague, Dr. Kim Tallbear. I'm sure many of you know who that is. And we are the co-founders of Sing Canada, so the summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, the Canadian edition. So once again, thank you so much for having me and being patient as I find my stride here in the Zoom room.
Thank you so much. Who would like to be next to introduce themselves?
Aniwa Haskano. My original name is Gainhia'a, and my colonized name is Betty Lyons. I'm a proud citizen of the Onondaga Nation, but I am the executive director of the American Indian Law Alliance, and that's who I'm representing today. Our purpose at the American Indian Law Alliance is to work with Indigenous nations and communities and organizations globally in our struggle for sovereignty, human rights, and social justice for our peoples. And we're always committed to our original instructions that have been handed down through our ancestors in order to preserve our traditions for the 7th generation yet to come. And I'm honored to have this conversation tonight because I think it's so important, you know, to have these conversations regarding the doctrine of discovery and how all of this is intertwined. So I'm looking forward to diving in, and I am really honored and happy and grateful that you've asked me to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Thompson?
Scano, the Hunja Estoni, that's Tashuni Gali, Onyo Dahag. My name is Brian Thompson. I'm a citizen of the United Nations of New York. I'm Wolf Clan, and I happen to also be a physician, a native physician. And just to start off by saying, even within that, native physician, native is first. And just to say again, Yalago, a big thank you to the people who were here, are here, and will always be here. And that's Onyo Da'aga, also in English known as Onondaga. So Yalago, big thank you to everybody and to everyone who's invited me on this call. Done.
Thank you so much. And just to situate myself as well, I am Turtle Mountain Chippewa on my mom's side. She's an enrolled member, and on my dad's side, I'm Jewish. And I was hoping we could now turn to our first question, which is really asking how we center Native American and Indigenous communities and the Onondaga Nation as we co-think these multiple pandemics, right? Particularly with regard to settler colonial realities, the environmental and climate crisis, and the racism of COVID-19 and how these intersect. So I'm hoping that on that topic, people wouldn't mind jumping in to share their thoughts about why you think centering Native peoples and communities is so important as we specifically try to understand these multiple pandemics. And then also what elements of these complicated and overlapping issues you think are highlighted by centering Indigenous experiences, knowledges, and ways of being in the world, and what might be missed otherwise. And what might the consequences of such oversights, for lack of a better, a more forceful word, what might the consequences of this be?
I'll go ahead and say something really quick. I mean, before we even center ourselves with all of that, as Native people, especially for all Native people, we center ourselves with what's around us. So in Oneida, it's called Dunksa, and Onondaga, it's kind of Hanyo. But it's the words that we start out with, the words before all else. And we thank everybody for everything that has happened to allow them to be here tonight. Maybe you've had a difficult day or a long walk to wherever you're doing Zoom at. Maybe it's been a busy day, but we thank you for all the people that are here for being on. And then we center ourselves to everything that's around us. We center ourselves to Mother Earth, and then we center ourselves to, and we go through a process of thank yous where we center ourselves to what we're standing on, Mother Earth, where we came from. And we center ourselves to the waters and the land and the grasses and the trees and the animals. And we start to move up to sky world, up above. And we center ourselves to the wind and to the stars and the sun and the moon. And we go on, and we end up with Creator. But before we even center ourselves to all the things that we're talking about tonight, we center ourselves to where we are. Because as Native people, we think that everything's alive and not dead. The water's alive, and it not only gives us life, it's alive. And the grasses are alive, and the medicine plants that provide for us are alive, and the winds are alive. So we center ourselves to everything around us, and we give thank you for that. And we come together with one mind. We all come together as one mind. And that's how, before we even talk about anything else, and I think Betty would agree that this is how we center ourselves. And many other Native people do the same.
Yeah, I think that it's about, being, our idea and thought about it is that we're all everything is interconnected, that everything is in a relationship to something else, and that everything around us, there are relatives, right? They're not these commodities, and that it's about balance. And that's what's happening is with these pandemics, is that we're at an imbalance, right? So first, I want to stress that the multiple pandemics are really all a part of just one big pandemic, and they're not separate. And it all stems from the doctrine of discovery. And Indigenous knowledge doesn't compartmentalize all of these things, as Brian was saying. We have to ground ourselves in gratitude every day for everything that sustains us and keeps us going every day here on our mother, and that we need to think of her as our mother and not some resource or form of commodity. And that's, you know, that's part of the colonial, the settler colonial problem, right? Is that their mindset is about, you know, the mere destruction of that balance. It's about domination. It's about, you know, taking things out of that reciprocal relationship. You know, I was really thinking about how great your name is, even democratizing knowledge. You know, because if we look at the roots of democracy, it started right here on the shores of Onondaga Lake, which is what, 10-minute drive from Syracuse University, you know, and that the US patterned their government after our government, giving us credit. They finally gave us credit in session 331. But they left out the two most important things. They left out the voice of women. They left out the voice of Mother Earth. And not to see it as that, you know, they have rights, right? That, you know, this European mindset of they're going to be given rights or something. And I truly believe that is like where it went way off the rails, and it's not going to be fixed until, you know, women are fully included and the rights of Mother Earth are fully included. And we stop seeing everything as a commodity and seeing things as our relative, you know, and that we should be living in gratitude, and what Brian's talking about. Like that's part of it.
I guess it's my turn. I just noticed on the side there's 66 attendees, and so I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this evening. So when I was thinking about this question, I stumbled at a certain point, and that's where I realized, you know, I can't tell non-Indigenous people or anyone else why or how to center Indigenous peoples. In a sense, that is the privilege of being the colonizer or the settler, is that you get to choose if and when to engage with Indigenous sovereignties, unfortunately, right? And so we are currently continue to live that kind of power dynamic. And so for me, I center Indigenous peoples in the work I do because I'm Cree. It's a kinship responsibility. It's a relational responsibility to fulfill my roles to my community. Analytically speaking, it also allows me to, when I'm centering in my own research, when I'm centering Indigenous peoples, our knowledges, our experiences, and also our stakes in research, I'm able to analyze the colonial power dynamics that are shaping any given phenomenon or field or what situation, whatever context I'm looking at. And I think that analyzing power, colonialism in particular, is extremely important given the ways in which multiple colonialisms around the world and imperialisms are interconnected globally. And also, we're seeing, we're living with the impacts of that deeply global interconnectedness that we're living through. So I'll stop there for now in case anyone wants to jump in.
That's really wonderful. I want to thank you all. I think that we're hearing a lot in terms of Indigenous responsibility, right? And how we relate to the world around us. This notion of 7 generations thinking, being interconnected, and thinking about how we have relatives. We're not just engaged in transactions with a planet or with each other, or with the world around us. These are really important. I'm wondering if anyone has something they'd like to expand on a bit further at this point.
And even the concept of, when we're talking, there's so much discussion now, rightfully so, why it took all of this to elevate it up a little bit. But diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, a lot of people like to use that word belonging, but what does it really mean? And, when we you start out greeting people. You say Sugoi, Minaida Sugoi, Sugoi Scano. And Sugoi is not really, it's not really like it's not really like a hello. It's like hello. It's not really like a hello. What it really means is I see you. It's not only that I see you physically, that you're there. Like I can see the screen right now and I see you. But it's deeper than that. And and you have to take it a step further and say, it's not only that I see you, but I see you as a person. I see your history. I see where you are. I see what it took for you to be here today. I respect you. I see the things that have maybe have happened to you. So everything that you're carrying with you on your back, maybe you've been carrying your whole life. I try to see that. And it's a deeper level of respect and really belonging. I see you. And, I think that just starting out with that and skana, peace, not only means peace, and it doesn't mean just, peace in your everyday affairs, but peace in your heart and peace in your mind, and peace not only within yourself, but peace with everybody else. And to have that, maybe some people call it tranquility, some people just call it humanity, but not being dehumanizing. But we have these concepts that Peacemaker gave to us. Skana, peace, Ganigolio, a good mind in everything that you do. And if we have peace within ourselves and peace with others, and we try to use a good mind in the things that we do, we develop a collective, a power that can change things. And it did change things for the people, for many Native people and people of Onondaga, in terms of how they dealt with the pandemic. Those concepts that have been handed down to us long before anybody else came to our shores here. And we were just us in Wehonwe. Skana, Ganigolio, peace, and using a good mind.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the good mind and how important that is, it's not like the absence of conflict. It's how you work through that conflict, right? It's how we see the world and how we try to navigate these adversities, and that our responsibility is very great, because we have the responsibility to speak for things that can't speak for themselves. And something that Brian said about Scano, meaning, peace. When we say Nyoha Scano, means like, I'm thankful that you are well. And that wellness comes from a proper relationship that you have, with all other living beings. So yes, that it's very important that, these discussions that we're having. And I'm sorry to say that, now when we hear these words, thrown around, like caring for somebody other than yourself is socialism. I mean, I become just, it's like, what? It's so hard for me to even understand that. Like, as Brian was saying, our community is, we help each other in times of need. We help each other's communities in times of need. It's not just here, it's, it's everywhere. And so, when I think back about it, here we were talking about the right roots of peace, and they're talking about white supremacy. There's the difference, right? Like that's the mindset that I'm talking about. Like that's the stark difference. That it is about this reciprocal relationship. It is about working together and helping one another, and not this self-gratifying egocentric kind of way of thinking. that it's beyond just me and him. Like, even when I'm looking at Jessica, Danica, Brian, and something that Brian said that really kind of resonated with me is that you're really seeing that person, as a human being, right? They're not just, you don't just dismiss it and, say hello and kind of walk away. It's about really knowing. It's a knowing. So.
That's fantastic. And if I might, just because we have so many people who are joining us this evening who, one, may not be familiar with the fact that Haudenosaunee democracy goes back at least 1,000 years, right, in this territory where some of us are located and where DK is located, and also what the white roots of peace, what that means, if you might be willing to expand on that. And then just since I'm already interrupting, I'd like to ask, Brian, I've gotten a message to ask you if you could sit a little closer to the microphone. Thank you so much. So thank you.
So we'll back it up a little bit even from there. I wouldn't agree with that the Haudenosaunee have been here for 1,000 years. Been here since a lot longer than that. Thousands and thousands of years. We've been, we were placed in an area that the Creator gave that's so very special, and He gave a message, and even when we're talking about the white roots of peace, or there's a story behind that, and we'll just start out by this a talk for Syracuse University. So, if you go up at Hendricks, I believe it's Hendricks Chapel. I haven't been up there in quite a while, although I'm staring right outside at Syracuse University right now. But there's a wampum belt that is a flag that has risen up in its Hiawatha belt, and you'll see purple, and you'll see little white squares, and really it's an idea of a confederacy, a coming together. Originally, we were warring together, and the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and a peacemaker came to this area and said, "There's a different way, using a good mind, Ganigolio, Ganigolio, and Skana, peace. And by working together, we'll be more effective, more powerful than individually. That if each one of us, each one of our areas, Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayuga, Senecas, will symbolize it as an arrow. Peacemakers symbolize an arrow. And so if you take one arrow, you can snap it, you can break it, and things can occur. But if we put them all together and we wrap it together with the leader of the animals, the deer, you wrap it with sinew, and you try to break that, you can't break it. And it's not been broken. And so when you look at what's over SU and you think about just a simple lesson of what we could use to improve ourselves as people on a daily basis, you'll see two little white lines that extend out to the edges of that flag. And what it means is is that we're not exclusive. We're inclusive as people, as Native people. We are inclusive. That there was that area in the middle that looks like a tree is what they symbolize by the tree of peace. And when the peacemaker came and gave these lessons to the people here, who have always been here, that they buried the weapons of war under that tree, right at the edge of one of the most, if not polluted lakes in the world, Onondaga Lake. That, I grew up here, and if you hadn't grown up here and you're not, I'm going to be 57 years old. When I was a kid, that lake stunk. It still stinks. And, but it smelled bad. It was just raw sewage that was dumped in one of our most sacred, if not sacred areas. Just a travesty. But Peacemaker placed the weapons of war under that tree and said, we will come together with peace and a good mind and work together for the people. And like any tree, white pine has long roots that stretch out into Mother Earth. And whoever wants to come and join with this message, Skana, peace, Ganigolio, good mind, can join onto and follow those roots of peace, those white roots, back to the Haudenosaunee, back to Native people. We're inclusive as a people. And that's what, to me, humbly, the roots of peace mean.
Thank you so much for the clarification. And just to make sure I understand, I thought that it was that the peacemaker arrived 1,000 years ago. At least am I at least 1,000 years ago, or am I?
Yeah. No, you're over 1,000. It was over 1,000 years ago. Yep. The peacemaker arrived on the shores of Onondaga Lake.
Okay, thank you. I'm hoping that you might be willing to tell us about, you mentioned white supremacy and the white roots of peace. And I think the juxtaposition there is really significant. And I'm hoping you might be able to provide us with a little background and a little more.
Yeah, so, so the difference, what I'm trying to show is the glaring difference between the value systems, between our peoples, right? And what we value and what our European brothers value was totally at odds with one another, right? Ours was about inclusivity, as Brian spoke of. It was about the relationship between all living beings. And then, they come here on the premise of the doctrine of discovery, which is all about domination, control, subduing the land, all of those things, commodifying everything, people, land, territories, resources. To this day, that's, pipeline, line 3. I mean, I could go on and on when you glaring examples of this. And, that's, I think, what, in terms of knowledge, what we have to impart, right, on other people, that I think that should be gained from this, that kind of mentality is, everyone should understand that it's no longer useful, but they also need to understand where it came from. Like, where the beginning of that idea of being able to own somebody else, being able to commit genocide, right? And I'm really interested in hearing from Jessica about, the genetics of all of that, right? Like I'm like so excited that you're here to talk about that, because it's something that I know is generational. I mean, I can feel it in our family, right? From boarding schools, all of that. So Yeah, that's just what I wanted to say about that was that, we really, really have to think about where this comes from, and if it's going to stop, or if people want it to stop. There are some people that don't, right? Because they benefit from it not stopping. They benefit from continuing this, ravenous thinking to commodify everything and to own everything. Um, and and so I really hope that out of this small discussion, that some people will gain the knowledge that it is a value system, as Oren Lyons always says. We have to have a value change for our survival. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Jessica on this.
Well, thanks, Betty. And thanks to both Betty and Brian. I'm learning a lot about Haudenosaunee ways of being and knowing, which I really, really appreciate. I mean, we could have a whole discussion around the different kinds of teachings from our distinct nations around the color white in and of itself, right? Our colors have a lot of meaning within Indigenous communities. So yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm not a geneticist by any means, but in my travels in and out of labs and working collaboratively with genome scientists, I have learned a little bit. So Betty, I would be happy to talk about genetics. I mean, the thing about, so when we're thinking about disease and colonialism, pandemics and epidemics and colonialism, historically, and historians of colonial science and medicine have done this work around thinking about how race is constructed in colonial spaces through discourses or definitions of health and disease. And through that racialization, Indigenous peoples have been, and other peoples have been pathologized. Our bodies have been pathologized. The way we relate to the land and to each other, to our kin, has been pathologized. And so while race is not inherently real, as we know, the ways over time in which people have been violently colonized, this does impact our bodies. So processes of racialization, colonialism, and what have you do end up impacting our bodies. A colleague of mine, Dr. Rick Smith at George Mason University, he does work in epigenetics. So epigenetics is, as far as I understand in kind of layperson terms, it's like a little switch that's like, if you could imagine on your DNA, a little switch at certain genes, and Brian probably can give more insight into this, but a switch that potentially turns something on or off. So in my colleague's research, he's looking at different degrees of methylation that indicate a certain kind of stress response in people. And so there's been various studies that have looked at communities of people who have experienced these intergenerational forms of trauma, and that this does impact, there is indication that your epigenetics or your stress response can be impacted and then also sort of intergenerationally transmitted. So our bodies are, and that's no surprise. I mean, we already know this. We already know as Indigenous peoples a relational way of thinking. And it's no wonder that, what my mom went through and what my grandma went through is going to impact me and my body. So there is some growing evidence of this in the scientific discourse. But I think it's really important to not turn to that scientific knowledge as a way to validate what Indigenous knowledge already know. I could take up this entire time talking about like genome sciences, and Brian, you had also mentioned about how long have our communities been here, our nation's been here. Well, I work with a lot of biological anthropologists, and they, it is so difficult at times working with them to be like, no, we're from here. Like, we didn't all just come through one little, migration through the Bering Strait. I mean, that's a gross oversimplification of their theorizing, but still, I mean, these different stories that are told about us, and really we need to be centering our stories about ourselves. I'll pause there, Betty, in case you wanted to jump in.
Jessica, that's awesome. And when you talk about epigenetics, and I'm sure that there are people on this call who can correct me and know 1,000 times more about this than I'll ever know. But there's studies, evidence that's been done, and it's not even pleasant to even talk about. But if you take a mouse, a pup, and you subject it to some type of terrible thing, whatever you want to think of, and that mouse is going to move to a corner of its habitat, its cage, where it is, where this is being done, and that mama mouse has little baby pups. And those baby pups, because of the trauma that the mom went through, the parents went through, even with that baby not being subjected to terrible things, that just a sound or something that a stimulus that was that was associated with that original trauma will cause those baby pups to move to the corner. And so you have intergenerational trauma that has been inflicted upon us as a people, not only to us, but also to other communities of color throughout the whole world. And there's scientific evidence for that. It's not disputable at all. It's only disputable in the minds of people who don't want to agree with it. But it's a proven fact.
Thank you so much. And I would like to second what folks have been saying about wanting to hear more. I would love to keep us going on this particular topic. I'm hoping we can come back to these questions. You bring up so many really important points. I do think that just for keeping time, we might open the floor to Q&A now. If people have questions they'd like to bring in, that would be wonderful. This is the first round.
Danica, I am sorry. May I maybe briefly explain that there is at the bottom of the Zoom environment, there is a button, Q&A button, and people can use, the attendees can use this button to enter their questions, and their questions can be asked anonymously, or they can, they can do it through the identity of the Zoom user. So please, anyone who would like to ask questions or make a comment, use the Q&A button.
Thank you so much, PJ. We actually had a question come in. I'm going to read it just so that everybody can hear what it says, and it's actually addressed to all three of you, which is perfect. First, it starts with Dr. Klopanek. Is there an epigenetics analogy in nature, landscapes, a lake? But this was interesting. And then they say, Dr. Thompson and Dr. Lyons, do you think that Onondaga Lake will ever be able to fully recover from its trauma? How many generations will it take? And if there will be learning from its history, what might that be?
I don't know, should I start or just?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure I fully understand the question, and that's likely because I tend to hesitate to use really quickly use particular metaphors. And I've been thinking about that because I think it kind of gets away from the specificity of things, and I think that that's really important especially in the academic realm. I was thinking about that same dynamic, even as we're talking about multiple pandemics. Well, a friend of mine, I was having a conversation with him. He's a Métis scholar, Dr. David Parent at the University of Manitoba. He was riffing off of Tuck and Yang's article that decolonization is not a metaphor, that it involves the restitution of Indigenous lands and life. And my friend was telling me, he was riffing off of that idea and saying, well, the pandemic isn't a metaphor either. That how can we think about the conditions under which this pandemic has happened, which involves thinking about those interconnectedness or that those interrelations that have led to all of these things coming together in such a fashion, but also doesn't biomedicalize things that are not like explicitly or directly biomedical. And I'll explain a little bit why I think that that's important. When I've looked at genome science, there's this growing call to include more diverse populations in genome studies. And this is often being held up in Indigenous contexts in Canada and the US to say, well, colonialism has caused these health disparities. So now biomedical research and health interventions are held up as like this pathway toward reconciliation, potentially. And it's a discourse I continue to see emerging. And so when if we are going to use metaphors, then we have to be careful because it can lead to an analytical lack of specificity that gets away from the empirical conditions under which our experiences happen. I'll pause there. I know that wasn't entirely clear. I was trained as a political theorist. I don't know if anyone warned people. I'm trained as a political theorist. So I'm very happy to have Betty and Brian here to translate some of my overly abstract language.
No, I really appreciate what you've said. I mean, something that is really resonating with me that you said a little while back was that science doesn't have to validate what we already know as Indigenous peoples, right? Like that really resonated with me. And in terms of Onondaga Lake, will ever fully recover? I mean, so first I'll say this, that people need to understand that there is no remediation for water once it's contaminated. There's no true, like you can't go back to the form that it was prior to the contamination. That's just not going to happen. Can we make it, can it become a lot better? Yes, it's still a Superfund site. They're still talking about putting a beach and having children and people swim in a Superfund site. I mean, what part of this don't you get? You can't drink contaminated water. You have to have water to live. Water is life, like that's that's all a part of it. I mean, and until people come to that realization, there's a lot of work ahead for us. And no, I don't think that it's going to be fully recovered in my lifetime. I think it's going to take many generations. I've already set my children up to take this on themselves, 20 years old and a 10-year-old. And, it weighs on them already. I mean, it's hard, but as it's like a responsibility. This is our sacred lake. If we're not going to speak for our sacred lake, who's going to? And it reminds me of a story that my son, Garrett, he's now 20 years old. We were driving past Onondaga Lake and he could smell the contamination. And he said, I don't understand. Why does it smell? Why does it, what is that smell? And I said, he goes, I thought that they were going to clean it up. And I said, well, Garrett, they didn't want to spend the money to fully clean it up. They didn't want to do the real work to get all the contamination out. This is like a Band-Aid. He's 6. He looked at me and my partner said, and he said, well, did they ask the fish that? Did they tell the fish they weren't going to clean it up? And that's what I'm like, that again goes back to that relationship to all things, how we teach our kids, right? And it's so interconnected.
From just knowing Onondaga Lake and the history of it, it's affected so many people. It's a long story, but with the with the salt mining that occurred, that resulted in contamination of Onondaga Lake in Tully, you see these things called mud boils. There's a giant hole in the ground from essentially just putting a big hole in the earth. The last time I read about it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the amount of earth that's taken out from below Tully in that area near Onondaga Nation is the size of 30 carrier domes. Imagine that underground, filling up with water, pushing mud to the top that goes in to a waterway that supplied a life source for the citizens of Onondaga in this area. But not only, because you have to also think as Indigenous peoples, not only for us walking, but the animals, the fish, the insects, the plants, the medicine plants, and everything else of how this has affected everything. So then it becomes contaminated with this muddy silt that is so depraved of oxygen that fish can't even grow. And I saw on this call two amazingly strong, wonderful people who I know. I just looked at the participants, Regina Jones and Tammy Bluewolf, who work up at Syracuse University. And they both know the same story also. When we were kids, you could swim in that, play in it. We did as kids. But now you can't even see hand in front of your face. And it's resulted in flooding. So now there's a dam, flood control dam at Onondaga. But it even goes a step beyond that when you start looking at the city of Syracuse, because that water that started this whole, the way that the water, the tributary goes through Onondaga and it ends up in Onondaga Lake, but it goes through the city of Syracuse. Not only does it go through the city of Syracuse, it goes through some of the most poorest, extreme poverty areas of the city of Syracuse, such that it causes flooding. So now you have some of the most marginalized people, urban people in the city of Syracuse, who now have to pay for flood insurance. Can you imagine? I mean, if you're a student from SU, you may not have experienced flooding in some of the poorest areas of the city of Syracuse, but it has happened and it will happen again. And this was the result, and why we look at things generations in advance when you decide upon something. That one decision of a company not only polluted Onondaga Lake, it hurt and destroyed and dehumanized Indigenous people, but it still continues to this day with our communities that are living in some of the poorest areas of Syracuse. And then it even goes beyond that, because now you have some of our new Americans who have come here that eat out of that lake, that eat the fish that's contaminated with mercury and other chemicals. And all of this from one decision. So when you start to look at the importance of a decision in generations to come, that's why it's so important to us to look ahead.
Yeah, I think something that, Brian was just talking about, the Department of Health, we had a study done for, the people that have come here to live in Syracuse from all over, the world really, that fish out of that lake and eat the fish out of that lake. And they found that their mercury level is 4 times higher than the average person. And they didn't even bother to do studies on children, pregnant women, or people over the age of 50. I mean, so, to that one next question that I see about, what does a shared future look like? I mean, it's about caring. It's a means about stopping this hierarchical system. The rich, the poor, right? It's about all of us looking at each other and seeing each other as human beings, because I don't even think that even happens yet. And the seventh generation thinking is totally about that, and making long-term decisions based on how that is going to affect the seventh generation yet unborn. And when I think about the years that I spent listening to our council make decisions, and even grand council, the deliberations, and I'm sure Jessica could speak to this about this too in her own territory, like the deliberations of your leadership and making these decisions, and how thought out they were, and it takes them so long. I mean, I see other countries make these snap decisions, snap judgments, and then the ramifications are endless and forever, because they haven't thought about how that's going to affect the seventh generation that isn't even here yet. And it's such an important value that I think that we have. That's another gift I think that we have.
Mm-hmm. And I think you've brought us beautifully back to thinking about the ways that Indigenous ways of being in the world are so fundamentally different than what came with settlers, that sometimes trying to have these conversations can be challenging, because in order to get there, we have to give so much background. And yet, I think that the way you are each addressing this question and the previous question pulls at us to really think about, I'm just going back to what Jessica shared about warnings about the challenges of trying to use metaphor to talk about material realities, right? And just to bring it back to thinking about the multiple pandemics and what it means to think about COVID-19 in the ways that you were addressing it a moment ago. Jessica, would you mind bringing that in briefly? And if anyone else wants to say anything about seven generations thinking, you're welcome to. We will open it back up to questions in a little while.
Sure. So I'm trying to remember what I said again. I mean, it's just this thing about with a pandemic. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing that either, but just like ideas, just they're there 1 second and then they're gone the next. So I would like to make a connection with something Brian and Betty we're both talking about, and that is about kind of more of a relational way of thinking that spans time space. And so thinking about COVID-19 as a relation. It is now a relation shaping our body, shaping our societies and environments now. And when the pandemic first when we started here where I'm at, started feeling the impacts of it, the university shut down and what have you, I was thinking back to the Spanish flu of 1918. I think a lot of people were, and how if we had been thinking, the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta is housed in this historic building. But it was used in the last pandemic as like a makeshift hospital or place where they took care of patients, overflow patients. And we joke about it being haunted, but we're also all like Indigenous people in our bottom hallway, right? So we're like, our Cree language teachers always bringing kind of protective medicines over to my office. And, like we are in relation to those spirits in that building and the stories that are told about how they died during the last pandemic. So we were living, every day on campus with that reality and that living memory of the previous pandemic. If at a larger level, at the scale of public health and policy, that was the way of thinking, perhaps the professionals wouldn't have been saying, well, this is unprecedented, and maybe there would have been a different situation to deal with things that we're at now. So I wanted to share that little story because I think and Brian reminded me of this, is like using these examples of our own experience are so powerful and far more explanatory.
But I mean, I'm a physician. I deliver babies, and I'm an OBGYN. That's what I do. But I've seen some of the most terrible things with COVID, walking through that hospital every day. And, when you never want to walk in that intensive care unit. And it's a lot better now than it was. But at the height of it, it was really devastating. And, for Native people, for Indigenous people, when they look at, we'll just go off subject for a second about COVID vaccine and hesitancy, not wanting to take it. Why would you not want to do something like that? Or why would you take the vaccine? It would probably be a better question. And for a lot of people, they say, well, I don't want to get COVID. But for Native people, for Indigenous people, and I can put the link in the chat, urban Indian, I can't forget, but I'll have it and I'll put it in the chat. And they looked at, that about 70%, it was out of Seattle, about 70% of Native people would take the COVID vaccine. And their reason for taking it was not for themselves, but it was to protect their elders. If we lose an elder, just one elder, because it's all oral history, books that write this down, it's oral history. We lose a library of knowledge, and it's our most precious resource. We lose our culture, our language, our song, our ceremonies, our way of life. And we do this for others, not for ourselves. And some people, say, and I hope we do get a chance to talk about, the amazing things that Onondaga has done for their people. And, some people say, Brian, what is one of your memories, or what is your biggest memory of all of this that has occurred in the past number of months? Was it living in my basement away from my wife and my 3 children because I didn't want to expose them to what I was experiencing? What I will remember the most, back when it was really bad, maybe it's hard to remember now, maybe April or May of last year or March, was going outside and not hearing an airplane overhead. Driving down the road and just having quietness. But what I will always remember and will remember, and taught my kids to go outside and just take a breath, is just to taste the air. It just, Mother Earth cleaned herself. If we would just allow her, we just didn't contaminate it the way that we do. the air smelled so fresh. And I can only imagine when I was smelling that and tasting that, the freshness of the air, that that's what my ancestors had a long time ago, before there were people that came to our shore. So, you know, we each have different memories of all this that occurred. But for me, it's just simple as smelling and tasting the air.
Thank you. And I think that's a beautiful transition to thinking about this next section of our conversation, where we're really wanting to think about what, if anything, COVID-19 has revealed about or made more visible the resilience and vitality of contemporary Native communities. And it seems like talking about the vaccines and those sorts of things is a wonderful way into that conversation.
Did you want to go ahead, Betty?
Yeah.
And Jessica?
Sure. So the question, can you just rephrase it? Say it one more time for me, please? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah. Just thinking about how COVID-19 has made it so that certain things are more visible or more evident regarding Indigenous resilience and vitality of our contemporary Native people.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. This has really put a spotlight on a lot of things. And someone in the chat, or one of the questions was about persons with disabilities and about, you know, how they're viewed in society. And I think, you know, it kind of goes together with how Indigenous peoples are also viewed, right? We're kind of invisible. And I think it goes back to changing like that mindset. So I've seen a lot of beautiful things also happen during this time. It has brought out, you know, literally the best and the worst in people. And you know, I'm just going to talk about, you know, our own community, that they really came together. The farm group, the Jeannie, who is one of our traditional medicine people. There were other medicine people that were doing medicines, you know, Ria, I mean, I could name a million names right now, that they were trying to get people, you know, our own traditional medicine to fight this pandemic, and how amazing that was, and how it really saved a lot of people's lives. We did lose people, unfortunately, and, you know, and it's trying to save as many as possible. And it goes back to like the difference even with, you know, between the federal, state, and local government that we have to deal with as an autonomous nation, in dealing with all that. And I think so much about Brian's wife is Danae, from the Navajo Nation. And, you know, they asked for ventilators, and what did they send them? They sent them body bags. You know, again, it goes back to that, you know, not even just being invisible, but it's about all the things that are causing that. And if we aren't going to learn from this experience, right, take everything that we've learned from this experience and really put these into, like, you know, better practices, right? What has this been for? You know what I'm saying? Like, we really have to start thinking about how we're going to make these changes, and the narcissistic thinking that's out there, to think from a more well-informed, caring, loving place, that it's not just about us individuals, but it's about us as a community. And so, you know, I really think about that, how amazing our community was. Brian, I mean, and he won't tell you himself, but if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have had vaccines. Like, he fought and pushed and got the ball rolling, you know, to where he could have lost his job, frankly. I mean, when I talk about him, I get emotional because he's done so much for our community that people don't even understand how much he's put out there of himself. and his family, and the sacrifices that people have to make sure that our families are cared for and taken care of, all of those things, you know. So, you know, I love him. He's like a brother to me. And it's, you know, I appreciate everything, all the hard work of the people at the clinic, you know, the farm workers like that delivered food boxes, generous donation that we got from a man that lives in Jamesville for two cows. I mean, just just that community spirit, right? That we need to keep mindful, that the individualistic way of thinking is not what's going to help us succeed in the future.
Yeah, I'll jump onto that vein, or that way of that line of thinking rather. And I think all of those are examples, excellent examples of Indigenous governance. And I think that that's what I've been noticing the most through the pandemic so far, is the assertion and operationalization and practice of Indigenous governance over our own communities and nations. So also examples early on, Indigenous people communities sprung to action and closed down their reserve boundaries and roads. There's an example of an Inuit community in Rankin Inlet, way up north, who in March of 2020, so right at the beginning, right away closed down their borders to a plane full of mine workers to prevent the spread, because they had learned from the H1N1 situation previously how hard our communities can be hit by microbes. So also healing practices. Brenda Child does this great, she does this excellent research and public engagement around the jingle dress, and how looking at its emergence among the Anishinaabe people during, like, about a century ago, around the time during the last pandemic, right? So these assertions of governance, vaccine sovereignty, communities trying to get those vaccines and for their communities. But the other thing I wanted to mention about what I'm noticing during the pandemic, for me, just during my everyday experience being a prof, is just, I'm so inspired by my students. And being in the Faculty of Native Studies, we have a large proportion of Indigenous students.
I'm so sorry.
That's them calling.
I don't know how to hang this up.
Maybe it was important to God. You got to get that. So yeah, my Indigenous students, like, they were going through so much, and these are students that were doing their masters and PhDs, and just experience, like, they couldn't go home to their families, to their communities, because they didn't want to bring it from the city back out to the reserve. They persevered and have been just excelling.
I'm gonna go off camera and make sure it's not important. I'm so sorry. It's about the family in the hospital. Excuse me.
I always take it as a sign, like, stop talking, Jessica. That's twice. I'll pause.
It's good though to talk about, like, something that you mentioned about our sovereignty and about our governments, right? Like, our nation shut down before New York State shut down. They still haven't opened up yet, and people are angry. I mean, like, angry that some of our businesses are not open, and our leadership's like, what are you talking about? Like, we're trying to protect our community here. We're trying to, make sure that the health and welfare and wellness of our community comes first. It's not secondary to the economy. I mean, to a great price, economically for our nation. They didn't care. It's like, no, people first, right? Like, that has to come before and above everything else, including our schools are still shut down, and they're learning remotely. And I think, I am so grateful, I guess, for our leadership and taking that stance and, saying no, like this is important. We need to stop, be mindful of what's happening, and that the pandemic is it's a living being, and it's going to find ways to keep living, to keep growing, to more so that it doesn't die out, and that's what I'm talking. That also goes back to, the seventh generation way of thinking. It's about that, not just thinking about tomorrow. You have to think long term down the road.
I think when I because I can speak a little bit about it, specifically for Onondaga. No, it's a story that's not told, and I hope that eventually it will. But just the pride that I have in seeing our teachings that were given to us come alive. They never went away. Skana, peace, Anigolio, good mind, and coming together to accomplish things that no one thought could be accomplished. There were we had a vaccine clinic down there, and we were able to vaccinate a number of the community, like all Native communities, all peoples. And it was a fight beyond the scope of this call. But there was purity in the message that came from the leadership at Onondaga. And there's a vaccine distribution plan that's been laid out by the federal government, New York State. But Indigenous people have their own vaccination distribution plan. And it didn't start with leadership. It didn't start with members of Congress getting vaccinated. It also didn't start with healthcare workers. It started with elders. It started with vulnerable elders, our most precious commodity. And then it moved from there. Eventually, healthcare workers got it, but elder care workers got it first. They care for the elders, our most precious commodity. Because this pandemic, this virus that has been here is no surprise to Native people. If you speak to Indigenous people, they'll say this wasn't a surprise. We knew this was going to come. It's been prophesied that something like this was going to happen, and it isn't the first, and it won't be the last. When you play with when you play with Mother Earth, when you play with the environment, when you disrespect it, things occur. So what occurred? Differences got put aside for the people. And this didn't come from the healthcare workers. It didn't come from anywhere else. It actually came from the leadership of Onondaga, who said, this is how we're going to do this, with a pure heart and a pure mind. So we had a vaccination plan, and the community came together. It wasn't, and I think anyone who works in the clinic will say it wasn't the clinic. It was the people that came together. It was there's so many different things. It was workers that were providing meals to elders and families. it was, there's a farm down in Onondaga. It was providing food, which Betty had mentioned. And Betty would be embarrassed when I say this. I'll just give one example. It just comes to my mind. Betty going to the store to shop for people, to bring it back to them so that they didn't have to go. She put herself first before she was vaccinated and all that, put herself at risk for her people. And I bet you Jessica's done the same thing. And it provided our cultural history coming alive in real time before our eyes. Scan, peace, Gainiko Leo, using a good mind, and the power of all that coming together. An amazing story. I can tell you that there were powerful medical people that came to the clinic at Onondaga because they didn't think that we were going to be able to do it correctly. And they said it was the most well-run vaccination clinic that they had. We had ambulances there. We had backups on backups. We had just the love of the people for people. And that's an amazing story that hasn't been told. I mentioned Tammy and Regina from SU. For all you SU people, Onondaga vaccinated, offered Native students, Native staff, Native faculty, doesn't matter who you were, come and get vaccinated. They offered that up. And Regina and Tammy put that word out, and others. There's so many stories of people coming together to provide for the wellness, number one, of our elders. You never, ever, ever want to be in that ICU by yourself. I've seen it with an iPad, and that's your contact to the world. It's lonely. We're not lonely. We're not isolated people. We're families. We're family units, and no one wanted to be like that. We cared for the people that much, and it wasn't just Onondaga. It was a number of communities everywhere. Where Jessica's from, where my wife is from. She's Dene, she's Navajo. She was so worried about her family during this whole time. If she was on this call, she would say that 8 people on her dad's side died of COVID. Her parents had COVID. 2 of her sisters had COVID. Her aunts had COVID. And they live out in the middle of nowhere on the Navajo Nation. So, we never, and it's not a medical talk, I'm a physician and I can give you stats and all of that. But I'll give you one stat, and this is from the APM Research Lab, Color of Coronavirus, March 5th, 2001. One out of 390 Native people that they quote died of COVID. 1 out of 390. Racial gaps, they're most likely to die of COVID. Native, Indigenous people, 3.3 times that of non-Hispanic whites. And in the latest stats from Navajo, 32,107 people have tested positive. But there's been incredible stories of resilience, of saving your elders, saving your language, Cherokee language keepers. I know in Jessica's area, they did the same thing. It's not unique. Just amazing, amazing stories. And I just wanted to say something before I forget about completely different about Onondaga Lake. You see people swimming in Onondaga Lake, but you don't see Native people swimming in Onondaga Lake. Don't swim in Onondaga Lake until you see the Indigenous people swim in there. There's your test right there of purity of water.
Thank you so much. Is there anything, and I'm sorry again for interrupting before, is there anything else that people want to share with that? Because I think one of the things that I'm hearing in terms of the ways that COVID-19 reveals these multiple, that we're experiencing multiple pandemics, whether it's racism, colonialism, all these other things, is thinking about the fact that with Indigenous situations, although most the average American, maybe even the average North American, has a tendency to think of Native peoples as a race, right? But Native peoples are nations. And so, you know, the way that you have each highlighted the fact that it's Indigenous governance that has really led the way, that it's Indigenous people that have been looking out for this. And for me, it ties back to the conversation earlier about epigenetics and all these other things, that one of the things our people have also learned is that you don't wait, right, to do these things. We have to protect them right away. And so thank you so much for sharing those really intimate stories. Want to return to a minute, if you wouldn't mind, Jessica, just in terms of thinking about the jingle dress and the work that Brenda Child does, because you're absolutely right. It was with the 1918 pandemic where we had the little girl have the dream of the jingle dress, and that this is a healing dance that starts in Anishinaabe country and spreads outward and is still done to this day. And I wonder if there's anything else that thinking about, just from your perspective as someone who studies science and technology, I think one of the things that the jingle dress, Indigenous governance, all these other things are revealing is that it's not necessarily about doing things at the absolute cutting edge, that our ways of doing things are their own cutting edge, if that makes sense. I'm not sure. But just if you have anything you'd like to share about that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I certainly study what science and technology fields, how that impacts Indigenous peoples, but I'm also extremely interested in how Indigenous ways of knowing can shape sciences and technologies, and breaking apart that hierarchy that positions our knowledges as being less valuable. So one example I can think of off the top of my head, in Saskatchewan, which is just one province over from where I'm located, there was a First Nation. I cannot recall the name of the First Nation. I'll have to look it up afterwards, but an elder in the community had a dream to have a ceremony to actually help, like it was specific to helping their community during the pandemic. But when, as far as I understand, you know, all kinds of protocols were, like COVID safe protocols were put into place. The event occurred outside and things like that. But the RCMP, like our, I don't know what the equivalent would be in the US, but the police came and broke it up and tore down like the ceremonial items and everything. And so it really raises this tension that continues to occur, that despite our governance practices, despite our knowledge systems and what have you, like we're still also trying to operationalize that in contention with colonialism and that sort of interference. I'm wondering if maybe Brian or Betty might also have some examples drawing on their own, you know, community ways of knowing in terms of healing practices.
Go ahead, Betty.
Go ahead, Bri.
Jessica, But in terms of different healing practices for the COVID, or I'm trying to remember what the question was.
Yeah, I think Danica was asking like not only scientific ways or biomedical forms of healing. I guess it's broadening this concept of healing to well-being or some kind of relational way of being that may have helped during the pandemic.
Sure. I mean, you know, there are certain foundational views that all Indigenous peoples have, but there's so many different nations, not tribes, not reservations, nations, and they each have their own ways and their own healing practices. So I can really only speak about you know, our area here, but you know, there's, I think Betty had mentioned, we have, you know, everything that we need to survive has been provided for us through our medicines, our plants, and it starts with us being in touch with everything that's around us. I think I mentioned at the beginning that we view that everything's alive and not dead. You know, the animals, they give themselves to us. The plants give themselves to us. The air gives itself to us. The water gives itself to us. And, you know, without, you know, getting into, because there's been, you know, individuals who, you know more about this than I'll ever know in 1,000 lifetimes that do healing practices. You know, I wish sometimes I had as much knowledge about it. I have about as much, you know, in a cell of a, you know, of my body that they have. The faith keepers and others, like I think Betty had mentioned Rhea, and there's others too. But incredibly powerful people. But what I've helped to teach my own kids is to just go outside, and you know, we have a large garden, and teaching my 10 and 13 and 15-year-old about, you know, seeds and planting and how they sprout and life and the cycle of that and what they provide. And when you plant it in relation to the moon and what the moon does for us, what the sun does for us. And we go on and on and on and on and on. But also, you know, when you plant and when you harvest, by just looking at the sky, we can look up at the sky and know and say, I know where I came from. Betty knows where she came from. Jessica knows where she came from. And where we're going to go to. And, you know, and looking at you know, some of those teachings of looking at the stars, looking at the sky and trying to find out when's the best time to plant, when's different ceremonies supposed to occur in our culture, and looking at it from that aspect, and healing from that aspect, going outside or staying inside, talking to Creator, putting our words up, and there's been so much teaching that has occurred in terms of language and culture. Ceremonies, you know, I just want to say before I forget, you know, some people, they say I'm Dr. Thompson, right? I said I'm native first and a physician, because we have faith keepers within our culture, and clan mothers and chiefs, specifically talk about the faith keepers, who have nothing written down and know more about how to care for people than I will ever know. And I have such an appreciation for them, of their genius, their smartness, their intellect, their caring, putting themselves before everyone else. Just amazing people, like Tracy Shenandoah, for example, just to name one, of so many. But just healing yourself through your culture, healing yourself through your ceremonies, your language, your history, and teaching your kids. That's part of what COVID healing has been to my little neck of the woods.
I think it's amazing to see how our ceremonies, you know, even had to change. Like our leadership had to rethink it, right? Because you can't get together for the same length of time, you know, that we normally that would normally happen. So I mean, all those things had to be rethought, but that it still continued and it didn't stop. And one of the greatest gifts, I think, you know, from this time was that to spend more time with our elders. So we take care of my grandparents who are 92 and 98. And then we have an uncle that comes over all the time that is 91, and listening to them talk, right? Like, you know, because our house was kind of a safe house where, you know, everybody was vaccinated, and, you know, we could all kind of gather and eat together and still have that. And listening to them about, you know, my grandmother's, you know, 98 years old. She almost lived through the first pandemic, right? I mean, and then listening to all those stories and learning so much from all of that. But then I always go back to, it reminds me of, you know, our one dish, one spoon belt, first with an Anishinaabe, that, you know, the earth is like a big bowl, right? And we all have to share. Like we all have to share in this world. We can't just be greedy and just take for yourself. And like that, those conversations, having those conversations with those, you know, my grandparents and an uncle who was, you know, that was so powerful to listen to their stories and have them talk about that, how it used to be even during the Depression, and how they fed people and took care of one another, and to see that still happen again, how we still were feeding each other, caring for one another, kindness, compassion, all of that.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. And I think that everyone has really touched upon, just in thinking about the ways that Native communities prioritize things like elder vaccination and these other things. It really reveals, particularly when we're thinking about, say, New York, given that that's where some of us are, right? The ways that there's a scandal right now with the governor, because apparently there was not the kind of taking care and reaching out to elders and elder care workers, right, outside of Native communities in the same way. And that stark contrast, I think, is really something that I want to kind of underscore here, just to, in terms of kind of bring the conversation together before I open it up for our next round of questions. And that is to say that what I'm hearing is kind of comes back to that narrative about communities that value rights versus communities that value responsibilities, right? And that a rights-based individualist approach is so very different than community values and community-based organizing and principles and relationality as part of that very fabric. So thank you all so much. I do want to open it to questions. I'm not sure if we've had any more come in.
I just wanted to make one comment when you touched upon New York.
Mm.
There were certainly areas for improvement of dealing with New York State in terms of the vaccination process. And you know, and as a physician, I'm sure Jessica and Betty will appreciate it, is data and how it's presented. When you look at the effects of COVID within New York State, unless it's changed within the last 1 hour and 49 minutes, if you look on the New York State website, COVID tracker, vaccination, or excuse me, numbers of COVID, there is no category for natives or other. I'm not other. Betty's not other. Jessica's not other. Nor are we NA, not applicable or not available. We're not invisible. When we originally talked at the beginning of this, we talked about the word for hello, meaning that I see you, that you're visible. When you're talking about communities of color who are so invisible, marginalized, not just natives, you can go on and on and on. We could do days about this and DK more than probably I'll ever know. But that invisibility that Native people occur on a daily basis is one of the worst forms of racism. The hurt that it produces when you look and you're never characterized in any type of anything. So some of the things that people can do is advocacy for Native peoples, for the people of Onondaga, for healthcare funding. New York State has not raised the healthcare funding for the Onondaga Nation in at least 10 years. The average per capita Native person from the Indian Health Service receives less than $4,000 of healthcare funding a year from the federal government. Medicare, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, approximately 12 to 13,000. Medicaid, I believe it's around 9,000. Indian Health Service, less than $4,000 a year for every Native person. And finally, let's look at New York City since we're in New York State. New York City has the largest urban Native population in the United States at over 112,000. And they don't have a direct access clinic for their people. And Betty's been fighting for this for years. So for the people around, things that you could help to do, advocacy, visibility, and I'll stop there.
Danica, just I believe Paula Johnson has raised her hand.
Okay.
Yes, hello everyone. I want to just thank you all again for the gift that you have given us all this evening with your perspectives and with your knowledge, your experience, and your resilience. So thank you so much for participating in this program. I would like to ask a question, and in some ways, it synthesizes several of the comments that have been made by the panelists. So, for instance, Dr. Thompson mentioned that in this idea of valuing every person, that what is communicated, or at least what is sought to be communicated, is the notion that I see you. And in stating that, it also means that I know and understand your history. And I think that presumes, in fact, that one knows the history of the other. And I think that this conversation, particularly as we have been talking about, for instance, the origins of democracy from the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois Confederacy, that people don't know that history. And as someone in law, I think it is, just an abject failure of the recognition of the origins of the US Constitution, albeit with all of those exceptions and omissions that you mentioned. But so that we don't know the history, so that we can't in every instance say, I see you because I know your history, because we don't. And then the other point that's sort of related to that, and I think Betty Lyons, said something to this extent about colonialism and people being able to commit an act such as genocide. And I have thought about that in terms of the wampum and peacemaking, and the notion of who is expected to make peace. And generally speaking, the people who are expected to come to the table are the people who have been oppressed or who have been at the end of the acts of genocide, and then are expected to come, to the table to reach some sort of, accord in some sort of way. And I wonder if you see those things connected. And I guess lastly, I would say this, and that is within that context, right? Who is expected to make the peace and come to discuss the peace? Who is supposed to know whose history? And with that, who is entitled to be angry about the system? As a Black woman, we are so often described as angry, as though it isn't legitimate to be angry about the conditions which we see and experience and resist. And so I wonder if any part of that is something that you would care to address. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up all of these things. I wrote down some little notes for myself so that I could remember all of the, all the things you were talking about. But definitely the intentional acts of erasure. There were so many intentional acts of erasure that still continue today that plagues why there is no real understanding of us as Indigenous peoples. It was intentional so that the genocide could occur, so that they could control lands, territories, and resources, and then to commodify them. I think that there are ways to make peace, even though we are the ones that have been inflicted. I look to places like Neighbors of the Onondaga Nation, who are an amazing group of people that go out of their way to try to make peace and find a way forward with all of this. But I will say this, though, that reconciliation can't truly happen when you're talking about over 500 years of genocide, when it's still happening. First that's got to stop first, right? We're talking here in Central and South America, like, could we just please stop that first? We can't just jump to reconciliation. That's what governments want to do right away. Okay, it happened. Like, let's forget about it. We're sorry, and then let's move on. No, I think that you're right. Education has to take place. It has to, the real and true history, our collective history, the real, proper, and true history has to be told, because it hurts not only the oppressed, but the oppressor as well, because that's what you're seeing with this sense of entitlement, the sense of, white supremacy. All of that is because that hasn't been part of the fabric of their education. I hope that answered.
Thank you so much. Yes. Would anyone else care to comment on any part of that strikes you?
Totally different angle on seeing, but I like to think about bell hooks's oppositional gaze. So I'm always thinking about looking back at the colonizer, looking back at the patriarchy, and that's because because we have been seen according to their logics for so long that it's like, hey, that's why I'm in academia, for example. I'm here because like that time is over. You know, we're going to represent ourselves. And not only that, but I'm going to tell you what I think of you, how I see you. And, you know, and when I talk about whiteness, it's in terms of from Aileen Morton Robinson, a regime of power. And it's a set of dispositions, it's institutions, it's discourses, and all kinds of things. So I think looking at now, this is a totally different kind of seeing when I'm looking back than what Brian is talking about, but it is also connected to my ontology as a Cree woman. It is also connected to the ways I've been taught how to see and our knowledge of whiteness and our knowledge of power. And our other teachings as well. So I just wanted to add that little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just to make sure there weren't final words that anybody wanted to share. I think you all gave us some really wonderful, juicy bits there at the end. So thank you so much. I want to turn it over to PJ to close us out. So thank you so much for all joining with us this evening. And thank you also to our speakers. I know that in real life, everybody is clapping right now. You've been wonderful, and thank you so much.
Thank you. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists, and to Betty, Jessica, Brian, to Danica for co-facilitating. Thank you to the ASN interpreters, Kate and David and Jessica, the second Jessica who was working in captions. Thank you to all of the attendees and all of those who were following the event on YouTube and on Facebook. And one very compelling statement from Betty when you engaged in the meaning of democratizing knowledge, right? When you know there's an invitation to the panelists, and you always have to ask and wonder, right? Where does the invitation come from? And what is the intention? What is the purpose? What is the meaning of collaboration? Or maybe, as Brian was saying, of seeing each other and seeing each other specifically, seeing each other's specific histories. And one of the things that we had reflected on in DK was the many ways in which this project of settler project of white supremacy, that is an epistemicide, right? It's an extermination of a way of knowing, a way of living, that has these long, long roots to the land, to sovereign land. And one of the things that we wanted to do precisely with this conversation was to push back against the notion that the pandemic has now turned us all just like, in the abyss of civilization, and that we are all equally standing in front of the chaos, in front of the abyss. And to respond to that in a decolonizing way requires that we learn that we have gotten here through very different histories of racialization, and also different histories of resilient ways of responding to the white supremacist settler project. So we truly, truly appreciate the generosity and the wisdom that you have brought to the conversation and to our hearts this evening. So thank you so, so very much. And until next time, Thank you, everyone. And before you leave, before we sign out, let's maybe bring everyone for a picture, the members of the collective and all of those of you who are right there as panelists. If we could take a picture. Thank you, all the attendees. Linda, maybe is there. Linda is coming. Wonderful. Okay, there we go. Adam, I don't know if he wants to come. Here we go. There you are. So now, yes. Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful evening. And maybe if anyone would like to close us with a farewell in their language, in their indigenous language, that would be also lovely.
Sorhonsios Kanjokwa. Neo Naji Nateo Handu Yodetu. Schools Kajian Dwamini Niungwan Gula. Tahatona Haladun and Sumbaya Dizu. Ji Agagu Oskana Umpahadunya. Antonio Duhak Niungwan Gu. Agregu Skatian Dwamini Niungwan Gula. Tena Haladun and Unkino Ha Hunja. Ji Segu. Yo Diliwatan Jitu Hadi, Antonio Duhak ne Yungwanigu. Agregu Skitian Damini Yungwanigula. Ten Haladu ne Omeganos Haguha. Jit Segu. Yo Diliwatan Jitu Hadi, Antonio Duhak ne Yungwanigu. Agregu Skitian Damini Yungwanigula. Ten Haladu ne Candilio Suha. Jit Segu. Yiriagatu Hajas. Dani Tonya Duhak ne Yungwanigu. Agregu Skadian Gawini ni Yungwanigula. Dai Tenhalaru ne Awela Suha. Jit Segu. Lona Deliwatan Jidu Hadi. Datonio Duhak ne Yungwanigu. Agregu Skadian Gawini ni Yungwanigula. Dai Tenhalaru ne Gaye ni Hungwerge. Jit Segu. Nunki Nigula Dudges. Dani Tony Duhak ne Yungwanigu. Agregu Skadian Gawini Yungwanigula. Dahetwan Haladu ne Skenya de Leo. Jitnate. Solivayanto. Ne Ganahela Dunsa. Antonio Duhak ne Yungwanigu. Agregu Skadian Gawini Yungwanigula. Dahetwan Haladu ne Sungwaya Bizu. Ji Oliwagwegu Loen Dao. Antonio Duhak ne Yungwanigu. Da Haswilage ne Kanjokwa. Ne Tonio Le Wakweni ne Ganahela Dunsa. Antonio Duhak ne Yungwanigu. Dani.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Onagiwa.
Except.
Miigwech.
Okay, that was great. I'm waiting for all. I have to save.